Well, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's a big day. It's Leading Brands Reveal 2020. For us, this is one of the biggest days of the year, and historically, I think it's been just a really awesome way to get together with everybody in the market and sort of compare notes and talk about what's going on. Unfortunately, this year we are, all in social distancing world and quarantining, so we'll have to do this virtually. But I thank you for joining us. We have some really interesting insights that we want to share with you today, and we'll go through it momentarily. But most of all, I just want to thank you all for your work with us at Government Executive Media Group. It's our role in this market is to sort of access government and share those insights with you. And so for me, there's not a better way to spend my day. And it's also a big day for me and Daniel. Not only are we sharing the new Leading Brands report, which we've been working on for months, but we also showered and shaved and got dressed up today. So thank you all for making us keep clean for you. All right, so let's get started. So Daniel, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So this is our 6th annual Leading Brand study, and I want to just share some of the trends. I'll go to the prior slide, Daniel. One more back. I just wanted to introduce Daniel too. So, Daniel Thomas is our research director for Government Business Council. Government Business Council is, our research division of government executive for, doing audience surveys, for doing client surveys. We use it for our own product development, and often they're sort of the in-depth analysts that are producing issue briefs for clients as well. So Daniel's been working with this study for years, and we'll both be sharing some of the insights as we go through this. He's the real data wonk on this. I'm just here to present. So one of the things about Leading Brands is that I wanted to share is, we'll go through the methodology, but the real purpose of it, from my perspective, is that it is the voice of the customer. We survey about 3,000 people across government, and you find some really interesting things. And it's always a little bit different than what I'm hearing in the BD world. So I feel like there's 2 types of buzz in this market. On the one hand, you have what people are chattering about at BD events and ACT-IAC and among our partner relationships. And then this Leading Brands gives us what government is chattering about and what's really moving the dial. And there's always a few surprises. And this year, with COVID and the changes that have happened, which we'll go through, there's just a lot of really interesting things happening and changes into the dynamics. Before we get started, I also want to thank Lou Ann Brossman and Government Marketing University, GovMarkU. They have helped us coordinate a series where we've been talking about what it takes to be a leading brand. I don't know if you've seen the prior webinars that we conducted, but we had lots of different insights from companies that have been profiled in the past, who are leading brands in the past. And we couldn't do it without Lou Ann and the team at GovMarkU. So if you haven't participated in one of their events, you definitely should. It's a great networking group. It's a great educational group. And it's just very unique. I think it's something that's very just intrinsic to this market. So I just wanted to give them a quick shout out. And then, with that, I think we'll get started. We'll move on. So first I wanted to set the landscape a little bit. Let's just remember here, even though we're 3 or 4 months into the COVID crisis, 2020 has not been your typical year. So we've seen tremendous changes in just how we work, and the government's seen tremendous changes in how they work, and priorities dramatically shift in a time of flux like this. And we're seeing some of that in the data. This study was conducted after, the middle of March, when everything started moving to work from home and the government started ordering people to work from home. So this is really the first brand study that's been conducted since the COVID crisis became a national event. And so what we've seen during this last year is not just divisions around how, not just political divisions, which you'll see some of that in this, but we've also seen government in crisis and government in crisis mode for an extended period of time. And so, as we think about this data and you think about your strategies, it's worth remembering that this is really post-COVID data, and the COVID crisis isn't going away anytime soon, I'm sorry to say. So, as you think about some of the dynamics here and the early changes that we see, it's worth thinking about those not as a temporary blip. It's not like a government shutdown that sort of came and then it went. This is something that's going to change and define the landscape for the foreseeable future. The other thing that happened this year was there were just a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and every year we have a couple, but I just wanted to name a few that I think are relevant as we go through this, because it does change rankings in some ways, and it does create a new relationship with customers. And you see that in the data as well. So, we had UTC and Raytheon merge. We had Salesforce buy Tableau. We had Symantec, which was a leading brand in 2019, which was acquired by Broadcom. And then you had the L3Harris merger, which we talked about last year, but was really completed after last year's study. So it's really the first year that we've had a full year of L3Harris data in here. So, as we go through this, we'll share more about these cases, but all of that is to say, it's just in all the years that we've done leading brands, I've never had more dynamic external events occurring. And so as we go through the data, there actually aren't a lot of fluctuations in the data, but it's worth considering that as we go through some of the big mega trends that we're seeing. So with that, we can go on to the next slide. So this is the largest study of government decision makers available. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we do it and how we do it. So, we survey about 3,000 government managers at all levels. And we designed it to gauge where your brand sits in the market. So as a government contractor, we're trying to be as helpful as possible to you. We gain a little bit of insight from this, but really we wanted to make sure that people who are going to market and changing, messaging, changing strategy, that they would have a tool that they could use. And what we found is that there are a litany of uses for it. You can use it to plan your marketing plan. You can use it to target specific areas where you're weak. You can really get a good definition of what your brand's weaknesses are, whether it's a trusted brand, whether you have problems with employee care, whether you have an issue with a certain demographic group like women or African Americans in government. So what we've seen is that it's turned from just kind of a marketing planning benchmark to a real strategic planning tool. We survey on 85 total companies in the study, and we'll go through the criteria of how we include different companies. But it's a fascinating view of how the government customer views the market. So Daniel, do you want to walk through the methodology for us quickly?
Yeah, happy to. So I think that Tim just gave a great overview of the study's purpose. Before we actually dive into the data, first I want to provide some details about how we conducted this study this year. So we've started fielding the survey in March, late March of this year, and we continued fielding through June. To ensure a random distribution of respondents, we deployed the study to a random sample of our GMG readership through regular email blasts. Since this is a survey measuring public sector perception alone, we really made sure that the survey is designed in such a way that one must be an active government employee to participate in the full study. So we also ask a series of demographic questions throughout the study to better understand the exact type of government decision maker and what their perceptions of the top brands are. And so when it comes to selecting brands, every year our team goes through a vetting process whereby we conduct an initial poll to test baseline familiarity with the list of brands that are up for consideration. So this means that some companies make the cut, but that others don't. And there's a few other factors that we weigh, which is one is just how competitive is the brand, and does it possess a stable of established competitors? Another is just, has it conducted and does it continue to engage in business with government customers? Third, has the brand been involved in any major contracts from the past year or that are currently underway? And finally, as I already mentioned, the level of familiarity it's generated among a public sector audience. So let's move next slide. So as Tim said, we're now in our 6th year. Leading Brands really is the largest study of its kind that tracks brand sentiment and associations in the public sector. And what you see here below is a quadrant that our team uses to categorize brands based on an intersection of 2 attributes. The first is how familiar is your brand to a government audience? And the second is how favorably does the government respondent perceive your brand? So do they like your brand in general, or does mention of your brand bring up a negative association? When we ask about familiarity, what we're really asking about is how well known is your company as a provider of services to government employees. So it really is localized to the brand's business dealings with government specifically. So if you're a brand who is better known and more familiar than the average brand in the study, you will find yourself in the top 2 quadrants here, either conflicted or renowned, and depending on whether the respondent favors your brand more or less than the average brand in the study, that will determine whether you are what we call a conflicted brand or a renowned brand. So the goal of this is really just to give you an accurate baseline into where your brand currently falls. This is not static either. Frequently see brands move from one side to the other, or fall or rise depending on a variety of tactics or developments over the past year. So
I just want to point out, Daniel, too, here, as you get customized studies, and we can customize the study based on your competitive set, you'll see not only your brand here, but we'll call out the other brands that you want to benchmark yourself against. So you may be in a competitive set that is not in the renowned sector, maybe best known among the 5 competitors that you care about, or you may be unknown competing against a renowned brand. And so this matrix is really helpful in defining your competitive landscape. You'll see like defense companies generally fall a little bit higher in awareness and closer to the conflicted quadrant. You'll see consumer companies sort of fall in the upper right quadrant. And then, a lot of companies are, very well liked and have passionate fans in one part of government, but the rest of government has no idea who they are, and they kind of fall in the hidden gems area. So this is worth a lot of color and depth as we go through your individual company when we present to you.
Let's kind of give an overview of a few of the demographics of who we actually surveyed this year. So I think one of the most immediate revelations every year is just that these are not, the people we're surveying, the government employees, are not simply DC insiders. This, as you can see, 83% of the respondents are outside the DC metropolitan area. So even though we have a hub of active government employees within the DC VA area, you see a broad swath just across the country. Earlier as mentioned, we surveyed over 2,800 employees this year. 48% of those are women. So we do ask, a series of demographics, just around gender, around how long they've been in government, and items like that. We have about a quarter of respondents this year who are employed in state and local government. And about 3/4 of the audience that we polled are purchase decision makers. So that really means is that this is an audience of senior government employees and have the power to procure, essential technologies, professional services, or defense products for their organization. So earlier, we kind of went into a few criteria that we use, but just to reiterate, here are the list of 2020 brands that were included in this year's study. So we include companies based on those 3 primary criteria mentioned earlier. One is just their scale of business with government, using a list of top contractors. The number 2 is really companies that have entered the market. So we always do a broad sweep to identify any new entrants. Third is a combination of the first and second list filtered by companies who have enough awareness to qualify as a valid sample. And in 2020, this sampling gave us 85 companies to study. So this included, some of the largest contractors along each of the verticals. And there's a lot more variation in brand awareness in the government market this year.
And we get the question all the time, why isn't my company studied, or could you please add my company to the list? And trust me when I say we would love to double this list and be surveying on many, many more companies, but we just can't get valid samples if you're not on this list. You're kind of falling in a range where you're not able to get a valid benchmark unless we did a custom study and focused just on your company, which a number of companies have taken us up on. The other useful thing is if you're not on this list, there are many companies who have just bought the data of 5 competitors just to see what the competitive landscape is even before they enter. So if you're a Silicon Valley company starting up in this market and nobody knows your brand yet, but you're trying to get a sense of how to go after AWS and IBM, you should talk to us because we have a lot of information about the dynamics of the cloud computing market that might be helpful as you plan your go-to-market strategy.
So Tim, do you want to kind of explain the high level finding that we found this year on this
Sure.
slide? Yeah.
So now we're going to walk through key trends and our key takeaways. We're going to talk about favorability first, and then we're going to talk about familiarity. So favorability is really, from my perspective, one of the ways you can measure brand equity. We're talking about how much the people that know you like you. And so it's one of the axes that we showed you earlier is just how well liked are you. That's what it comes down to favorability. And in these tumultuous times, I think this is where we saw some of the biggest shifts in the overall study. And Daniel, you can walk us through the specifics here.
Yeah. So one of the biggest findings of this year, and I really, without becoming too speculative, I think that earlier the context around the pandemic and the shift to a remote work environment has colored some of the data this year, and that's reflected here. Last year, we had a range of favorability that was 41 percentage points. So of the most favorable to brands considered the least favorable. This year, there's a lot more flux. There's a lot more range. It's 54 percentage points. And I think it just shows that respondents really, there's less neutrality this year overall, and respondents were more willing to side positively or negatively when associating your brand with government business. And overall average favorability this year actually dropped by just 1%.
So that's the interesting thing for me is that the range widened, but the mean stayed the same basically. And you can see that in individual companies as we looked through the list, that they're just polarizing. Companies are increasingly becoming polarizing companies. And there are companies that are not becoming polarized companies. So the polarization is driving the range wider, but there still are many companies that had very slight changes in favorability. Then there are the lightning rod companies that are really changing their approach to the market. They may be involved in politics a little bit more than other companies. They may have large failures that have happened in the COVID era that actually change their favorability very dramatically. And we have one and we want to talk about here. Did you want to walk through Palantir, Daniel, or did you want me to do that?
Yeah, actually, I feel like you might be able to be more equipped to handle that point.
Yeah, Daniel doesn't like to surmise as much as I do. I can say things that Daniel can't say if he doesn't see it specifically in the data. So Palantir is a company that has, very much been involved in the, its owner's been very much involved in the Trump administration, very prominent supporter of the Trump campaign. And we saw a fairly significant impact in the market and in the results over the last 3 years around it. But as, as the political waters have gotten a little bit more stratified and things are more controversial, we saw a significant drop in Palantir's favorability year over year. And, it's a 67% drop, not a 67-point drop, but it's significant. And I think the polarization is, as many marketers, we're going to go through another example in a little bit, as many marketers are working with companies that get caught up in the political dynamic or get caught up in scandals, it is a very challenging position to be in, because what we're seeing now more than ever is that the political stances of companies are playing directly into their favorability of the government customer. And honestly, we've never really seen that before. Brands have been slightly modified by that, but generally you've been judged on the work that you're doing with your customer much more than the political atmosphere that's surrounding it. So it's just another case where I think politics is starting to play a much bigger role in the individual work of government managers. And they're going to take their own politics as part of their evaluation of your company. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about favorability and what drives favorability. We know from the data that you can move the dial as a communicator or as a leader on favorability much more than you can move it on familiarity. Familiarity is really hard to build. Brand awareness is one of the hardest things to grow. You need a lot of factors that come together to do that. You also need a lot of factors for favorability, but we've seen marketers take tactical actions on favorability to move the dial. And it really requires you to go after handle it for multiple years, go after some of the weaknesses that are present in the data. So when you look at the individual attributes that you're rated on, you can take the lowest attribute and you can actually move the dial on the lowest attribute, which raises your overall metrics on the brand, and then it increases over time your overall brand favorability. And there are 3 companies here that we've seen just year over year continue to move the dial on favorability metrics. And Dana, do you want to walk through them?
Yeah. So the attributes that Tim just mentioned, there's around like 7 to 8 that we examine every year. We want to make sure that they are we conduct a poll every year too to determine that they're still top of mind and that those are the top considerations that respondents think of when they associate a brand. We have identified that there is a correlation between high performance on these attribute metrics with your brand's favorability. And for these 3 brands that you see here, Accenture, Khaki, and Verizon, each of them is a different story but they all share in common the fact that they focused on building up some of these attributes, and their attribute scores just continue to see increases year over year. And for example, sometimes this was preceded by a drop in favorability, but these brands focused on a particular attribute, and then they saw a boost to favorability the following year. And that's the kind of just through years of conducting this study, we keep seeing that correlation at play, that the focus on attribute performance typically precedes a boost to one's favorability overall.
And the reverse of that is when we see your favorability drop, and which is basically, do people like you? It's usually driven by 1 or 2 things that we can identify, whether it's a demographic or a favorability metric. One of these qualities that we're talking about. And that's where you can take action. And we see that when people take action on these things, that ultimately by resolving that issue or addressing that issue, they can boost their metrics on that issue. And then the following year, it's a leading indicator that the following year, their favorability will rise again. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I think it's one of the tactical things that marketers can take on themselves. That's kind of as a strategic imperative for your company.
Yeah, and for those who are interested in, what does separate top leading brands from the rest of the brands that are included in this study, we actually really looked at that. And what we noted is that the leading brands from this year were marked by 2 things. One was they all had very high experience and expertise, and so you can see those ratings at the below. That's a rating out of points, so 5 being the highest that a respondent can mark a brand as. And so you see high points to experience and expertise. Those are the highest rated from this year's study among leading brands. However, it's really interesting when we looked at leading brands versus those brands who are not leading, value and customer service sees the greatest range. So it's really those attributes that set apart the leading brands this year from those who are not.
And I think it makes sense when you think about it. It really involves the full experience that people have with your brand. So next we're going to go on to talking about the familiarity ratings. And so, as we said, the familiarity is one of the things that measures brand awareness, basically. And many companies come to us and say, look, our leadership is really upset. We need to increase our familiarity immediately. We're going to do a big advertising campaign. And I think that's great. We love that. We can help with that more than anything. It's also very hard to build familiarity year over year, especially if it's just through advertising. And I'll go through a case study in a moment where we look at a company that's kind of moved the dial on that. But there are also external factors that move the dial on familiarity that are really, really important to look at. So Daniel, do you want to walk through some of the data here, and then I can give context to it?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that overall this year, we really did not see big changes in familiarity or favorability between 2019 and 2020, and it really just shows that those data points are pretty steady. And this year, familiarity it increased by 1 percentage point, and favorability had dropped by 1 percentage point. So you can see the study-wide average in comparison to Microsoft, and you just saw, this year, though, we did see some brands just reach record levels in familiarity. They've really increased their prominence in the market, Microsoft being one of those. Panasonic, however, in CrowdStrike, this is an actual percentage increase over their score from the previous year, but they also made just huge gains, and it just shows that even though familiarity is a bit more stagnant and less amenable to moving year over year, there's some brands that have made huge leaps, and I think it's worth investigating further why that is.
So I would just say we're going to talk more about Panasonic. They're definitely a brand to watch. They moved the dial on a lot of different metrics this year, and my feeling on that is that they've done a lot of work to build their brand in this space. Their sales in this space have increased, so there are more people using Panasonic products, and so it's Microsoft is a similar thing. As we go into COVID, people are reliant on Microsoft for personal equipment, right? And they're using Microsoft products. Microsoft had a number of major wins in in the cloud space, in the personal computing space, and so seeing them move up is kind of surprising. I mean, they've been around 70% for the last few years, but to move the dial as significantly as they did, I think they increased by 4% this year in awareness. It's just those brands like Panasonic and Microsoft that have consumer elements, that have commercial businesses, they tend to be able to move the dial on familiarity a little bit more. CrowdStrike is an example of the political brand that's the opposite of what happened with Palantir. CrowdStrike is, if you're not aware, one of the key players in one of Donald Trump's favorite conspiracy theories about the Hillary Clinton email server. And he's identified it. It's got a big role in a lot of the Q world. It talks about CrowdStrike a lot. At the same time, in the government, they've increased their government business, and they've been able to keep themselves out of the political fray, even though they're in this fraught position of sort of being a key so-called witness of the Donald Trump agenda in trying to figure out what happened with Hillary Clinton's emails. So if you're caught in that position where your company is suddenly, and it could be anyone, any day now, can be caught up in the political winds, it's a really difficult thing to do, but CrowdStrike did a great job of being able to kind of ride it out in a way that didn't impact their favorability too dramatically. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the backdrop of COVID, where we did see key changes in favorability around specific things with brands that were related to COVID. We've talked about a couple of them already, like Panasonic and Microsoft, but even if you just keep going down the list, the list of brands that increased their favorability metrics was really astounding. And it kind of, as we looked through it, it was like, well, what's happening here? It's like, oh, well, these are all brands that have been part of the government work from home crisis. So we saw Cisco increase their scores on innovation. Cisco is the platform we're using today, and it's, if they're on the call, I want to thank them for their work with us. Google has increased their customized products ratings, which is a huge benefit to Google, which has long been dinged for having poor customized products. And then we saw Verizon increase dramatically their value ratings in government. And so, these are just three more companies that may be seeing a significant impact in the post-COVID era. And you can go through a list of three or four other companies that we think also are potentially benefiting from this as well.
One thing that I find is interesting about this is that these are not typically in the past have been the attributes that have lifted brands so much as others that we study. Namely, trust is a big one that we look at, experience. So I find that it's interesting that brands, with high innovation and the ability to provide customized services this time around are really seen positively and provided that lift. So.
Yeah. And so I wanted to walk through an example because we get this question all the time is how, what's the case? What's the case that is a company that's sort of modeling high growth in their brand and government? And I just want to talk about Salesforce a little bit because they are a company that has not always been in this space. They're a Silicon Valley company. They're not Microsoft, in terms of brand awareness. And we've seen them consistently moving the dial. And one of our, fast movers, we'll go through fast movers in a little bit, every year. And so what we've seen is their metrics on favorability and familiarity have grown almost every year, going back 3 years. And so you can see their familiarity has gone from 14% to 16% to 20%. So now they're at the average, of the companies in the study, right? 20% is the average the average familiarity of all companies in the study. So it's, a big brand. Many of the people on this call know it very well. We all use it. We're customers of Salesforce as well. And yet their familiarity, 20% versus Microsoft 7%. So you can see where the lack of a consumer brand really impacts them, but they have been able to grow their awareness and their favorability. And when we look at it, it's really interesting. I think the things that really drive this, it's not just great marketing. I mean, they're great marketers and they're good people. And if they're on the call, I say hi to all of you, Eva and team. But the reality is that it's also, they've grown their revenues and they've grown their business with the federal and state and local government. And so they've been committed to marketing through that entire time. I see a lot of Silicon Valley companies that come into this market. They're not dedicated to the government market, and they're not dedicated to marketing consistently over that time period. So they're in and out. They're not quite growing their market share. And it suddenly is a marketing problem that they don't have awareness. And it's like, well, maybe it's a marketing problem, but maybe it's that you're not consistent and you're not growing that is causing the problem. So consistent brand awareness, consistent brand campaigns can make a big difference. And I think also just making sure that you are messaging around major government initiatives and not just broad-based messaging that's commercialized. We all know this intuitively, but we still see companies bringing their commercial message to government. It moves the dial much more clearly if you have a government-specific message. And what you saw with Salesforce was 3 or 4 years ago, they went after the government market with a very specific agenda, with a very specific team, and a very specific message. And lo and behold, this is kind of one of the models for how you can move the dial across favorability and familiarity. And then Daniel, maybe we can go through a couple other examples here of companies where we've seen them move the dial on trust.
Yeah, this also gives me a chance to talk about a few new features this year. So in the past, we have, one part of this study is qualitative. So even though we collect a lot of this really great quantitative data that our team dives into, we also just like to hear it straight from government respondents' mouths. And this is an example of where we can measure sentiment. And we ask several questions. One, some open-ended questions that just allow respondents to tell us, what 3 words do you associate with the given brand? This year, we also asked them, in follow-ups, if they rated a brand a certain attribute, we were able to ask them a follow-up, why did you rate that brand, a 4 out of 5 on customer service? And they provided a little bit more commentary than we've had in past years. So Google is one of those brands that consistently performs well year over year. You can see here on the left, we have a word bubble. The bigger the word, the more frequently it was mentioned by respondents. And so, this word bubble, every single word bubble for every single one of the brands that we look at, it contains a mix of positive and some neutral and some negative. We actually, map that out here. Google, 46% of people said something positive about the brand. Just 6% said something negative, and about half said something neutral, or that didn't have a sentiment tied to it. So Google's really, I think, just shown that they've generated a lot of trust. They are consistently innovative, and that's why those things, come to the forefront in that word cloud. One of the, when we asked respondents to explain why they rated a brand a certain way, these were just two quotes that we pulled from that. Someone said they're a company that thinks outside of the box for progressing toward the future needs of government agencies. And then another said, when I need to look for answers outside of what is available internally, I use Google. So you can tell that people really, there's a lot of brand loyalty that's been established here, and that's just very evident. Microsoft, same thing. You can just see in the word cloud, useful, professionalism, innovative. Those things really come to the forefront. They were mentioned most frequently. We had respondents this year who explained why they evaluated Microsoft the way they did. One said, Microsoft is an incredible brand and has captured a large share of the market with their products. They've been used for years, and they've made computers accessible to the average person. So, it really does give us a better lens into some of the quantitative data this year by having respondents actually explain, their reasoning and why they associate brands positively or negatively.
Yeah, you can really see the impact of, other factors on how people perceive your brand. For both Google and Microsoft, it wasn't necessarily their work with Microsoft or Google and government that was driving their opinion. It was that plus their experience as a consumer or their experience with them, in the broader world that made their opinion of those companies change. And keep in mind, we're asking them in the context of their work with Microsoft and Google in this study. There should be in a mindset of what's driving this for you at work, and still the verbatims come out having a large role to play with other ancillary products that they may use in the consumer world, or corporate or social responsibility work that company has done. So it really is, it's the sum total of your entire experience with these customers that moves the dial.
Yeah, exactly.
So now we'll move on to the fast movers, and these are going to be the companies that we're seeing rise the fastest among favorability and familiarity. And so, first we'll start with favorability. Daniel, do you want to walk us through this?
Yeah, so these, as Tim said, these are the companies that saw the biggest boost this year in favorability. They're not organized by that ranking. Believe this is just an alphabetical listing here, but I'll just go through them. Airbus, CACI, Collins Aerospace, Esri, Google, NetApp, Panasonic, Saab, Sierra Nevada, and Tesla. All of those brands saw really big lifts this year compared to their favorability score from 2019. And it's worth investigating further, what were the factors that caused that, but they were top of mind for our government respondents and really gained a positive association among them.
And you can see here that we got a number of companies here that are sort of on the emerging tech front, or on the front lines of COVID response with Esri and Google and Panasonic. We've got a number of very significant defense contractors, and I think we often see big fluctuations in the defense world. So Tesla is also something where they're doing work with government, but they also have a sort of a hot consumer brand as well. So you could see lots of different reasons are moving the dial for the fast movers on favorability.
Yeah. And so now this is the fast movers for familiarity. So we ask, again, I want to clear that when we ask about familiarity, we're asking how familiar are you with a brand as it relates to their work with government? And so I think it's important we understand when we're looking at this that these listed brands here, again, in alphabetical order, really shot up in familiarity. And we mentioned earlier, familiarity is not something that moves easily. It usually remains pretty static year over year, maybe a point up or 2 points up, 1 point down. And so it's really significant that these companies, Adobe, BAE Systems, Cisco, Citrix, Google, Graduate School USA, Management Concepts, Microsoft, Panasonic, and SpaceX, it's really significant that they were all able to use a variety of tactics to really raise their brand familiarity.
And when you think about this, what it takes to move the dial on familiarity, you'd think that small startup companies would have an advantage here, because you'd think that they'd be doubling from like 5% awareness to 20% awareness, but it doesn't necessarily fall that way. What you see here are a bunch of household names that significantly increased their familiarity this year. And again, if you go through it, it's Adobe plays a large role in work from home, document management. Google, we talked about. Cisco, we've talked about, also a remote specialist. Citrix, who we haven't talked about, is also a remote work tool. Microsoft, Panasonic. I mean, it's just, you can see that there are significant changes happening here, and it probably is based on the usage of government managers using tools from these companies. We frequently see training companies moving the dial here, and then you've got SpaceX, which kind of falls in the same category as Tesla, where it's just kind of a hot company that people are aware of because it's like in the news a lot. So really interesting dynamics here. So now I think we'll move on to the leading brands reveal. So as we go through this, we watch the leading brands data very carefully, and the leading brands definition is something Daniel can share. Do you have new brands this year? And Daniel, tell us, what does it take to be a leading brand in this list?
Yeah, before we share the list this year, to qualify as a leading brand, it really is, it puts you into the top tier of all of these brands that were included in the study. And there's really 3 major criteria. The first is that you must score above the study-wide average for familiarity. So you must be more familiar than the average brand in the study. The second is you must score above the study-wide average for familiarity and be well-liked, more than the average brand in the study. And then the third is your aggregate attribute rating must be higher than the average of the study. And that the aggregate attribute is the average of all 7 of those attributes that we measure for trust, experience, customer service, customized products, value, and those kinds of things. So it really means that overall you are an extremely well-rounded brand. You've established yourself in the market, but you're also maintaining a momentum, a positive momentum towards favorability. And you're really checking off the right boxes. People associate your brand along each of those metrics up. So it's an elite group.
All right, let's go through the list, Daniel.
Yeah. So we have Adobe, Amazon Web Services, Cisco, Citrix, Dell EMC, Dun & Bradstreet, General Dynamics, Google, Graduate School USA, Honeywell, IBM, Intel, Lockheed Martin, Management Concepts, Microsoft, Motorola, Northrop Grumman. This is Pratt & Whitney, SAIC, Siemens, Verizon, and VMware. So,
yeah, leave it so people can see it, because it's a big moment for many of the marketers that support these companies. And normally we give a big round of applause to everybody who's on this list, but it's really a rare thing to be able to meet all of those criteria. And this list is never defined as a certain number. It's not like the top 10. It's just whoever meets the bar, and that's where we end up here this year. And so congratulations to everybody. We'll be announcing this today with a press release. And if you're interested in more information about it, please just feel free to reach out to us, and we can give you press kits, we can give you information that backs it up. We're happy to do that. So with that in mind, I think we're going to wrap. And I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. It's a oh, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry, we lost you there for a second, Daniel. What were you saying? Okay, I think we lost Daniel. But anyway, we'll wrap up here. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. We've had a great time trying to sift through this data. It's so interesting at this point in the state of the world, what's happening in this market. I'm sorry we can't stay around and network with each other in person. And if you're looking for a new job right now, I'm sorry we can't have you out there sort of plugging away for new opportunities. But when the COVID, when we're able to get together, no, we will all be together. And in the meantime, just know we care about you. We hope you and your families are doing well. If you need anything from us, email me directly. You can always, if you're interested in the study, email advertise@govexec.com. But I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Have a great day and a great rest of your week.